Right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome back for the afternoon or evening session, depending on where you are in the country. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We are excited to have Brother Muhammad Jafar Lakhani. I hope I got that right. Okay. Who will be discussing legal issues for Islamic schools, an area some of us struggle with a great deal. We tend not to have our own school attorneys, so I'm sure that this session will be very valuable to our school leaders and our schools in general. Brother Muhammad advises schools and school districts and community colleges and higher education institutions on contracts, compliance, labor and employment, and student matters. He has drafted and negotiated commercial real estate and software agreements, counseled administration on issues relating to procurement, the Open Meeting Act, and the Freedom of Information Act. Brother Muhammad advises on employment matters relating to the Americans with Disabilities Act, Family Medical Leave Act, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. And he routinely conducts trainings and internal investigations to help resolve Title IX discrimination, sexual harassment, and misconduct complaints. We thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise with us today, Brother Muhammad. Welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much. I'm so honored to even be included with the group of speakers that you guys have, and just to be invited to this conference as a speaker. It's something that I've actually honestly dreamed of for a very long time, ever since I became an attorney, to be able to help the Muslim community in some special way that I have some special skill in. I can't even believe that that day has come, and I still don't actually think that it's here. But inshallah, hopefully you guys will, have gained some benefit or gain some knowledge from the presentation, and inshallah it will be of use to you. I will go ahead and share my screen. We have an hour and a half together, which is quite a long time to be discussing legal issues. And I'm sure that most of you don't want to be discussing legal issues for that much time. So what I will hopefully try to do is go through maybe for an hour, maybe even 45 minutes, and then leave the rest of the time for question and answer. I had the initial topic was LGBTQ issues, and let me share my screen before we start diving into that.
To reiterate, Brother Muhammad, legal matters is one of the areas that our schools really have a need for, and you'd be surprised at how many questions we have when it concerns to legal matters, so that you may get quite a few questions at the end.
Absolutely. So that's actually, I'll leave it up to you guys, actually. I have an entire presentation on LGBTQ issues, and then I also have like ADA accommodations during COVID, the ADA analysis by itself, and then vaccination. I think I have a couple other things in here to kind of go through. But once I'm done with the LGBTQ part of it, which was, I know that's what was on the flyer, then I'll leave it up to you guys as to if you want to do question and answers or if we want to do something else. Inshallah, I really like to, although we are not in person, I really like to make presentations as interactive as possible. So feel free to chat me. I have the chat open. If you'd like to, if you're able to unmute yourself, go ahead and do that. I don't mind interruptions with questions and things like that. I'm sure some of my co-hosts can monitor the chat. I have the chat open myself, but if you can monitor the chat, and if there's a question that comes in, feel free to ask. And then we can kind of go from there. This is a very serious topic, but as you'll see in my presentations, there's some cartoons and things like that. I kind of like to add levity to things. Although we're discussing a very serious matter, we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously, and inshallah we can do that. So now to the heart of it. We are going to be discussing Islamic schools, which are generally private employers, and the LGBTQ issues. As we know, as you guys have seen, in the last 10 years or so, there has been quite a change in our society generally with regards to LGBTQ issues, how they've come to the forefront, and how that has now made its way and permeated through our society. So these are issues that frankly are becoming more and more common as we move along in today's day and age. And what do I mean when I say that? If you think back like 10 to 15 years ago, if you were watching a show or if you were watching TV, you generally would not see homosexual behavior or transgender issues being posed. But now I recently found out that Arthur, the PBS Kids show, if you guys know Arthur, that PBS Kids show now has Mr. Ratburn, the teacher. He's actually homosexual. And they had an entire episode geared towards him and how he was marrying another man and how the children, the kids needed to understand that and what that all meant. Obviously, this poses a direct conflict with some of the Islamic principles that we've been taught. So how do we navigate that as that comes into our Islamic schools, let alone our society? But I won't touch on that societal part as parents and as role models that you guys deal with, but we will deal with the legal issues that come with LGBTQ issues as they relate to Islamic schools. Before we get too far down the road, though, let me just make one disclaimer. The disclaimer is that I am not providing any advocacy per se as to what your school should be doing. I'm only providing the legal landscape as it stands today, and this is an ever-changing. This is an ever-changing landscape. Just so that you guys are clear, this has evolved in the last 10 years, and it is a continually evolving issue. So it's going to change again. But today, for our purposes, I'm merely just providing the legal landscape and what the federal law says. Now, you guys may be in, there's 32 participants in here. You guys may come from all different areas of the country. And I'll get into this a little bit more. I'll emphasize this a little bit later, but state and local laws have their own, each school will be dealing with their own state and local laws. So we always have to watch out for that. I'm giving you guys the federal level guidance, and then I'm not providing any religious rulings, anything like that. And I want to make sure that each school decision, how you guys treat this issue, is always going to be unique. I mean that in the way that each school issue is located in different areas. They're located in different states, in different communities, and therefore their decisions as to how to treat this issue, meaning how to revise their foundational documents, what to do about their employment policies, that is all going to be different for different schools, because some of our schools, they're located in more progressive states where state and local laws are more progressive and give even more rights than the federal laws. And some of our communities are, in a more conservative area. Like, for example, if you go down to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, if you have an Islamic school down there, their community is probably more towards your side. Their state and local laws are probably more towards your side, more in line with Islamic principles. And therefore, you may not need to do as much because you don't interact with that issue. You don't have to address that issue as often, but in Illinois, for example, where I live, in California, for example, those are more progressive areas, and legal challenges are much more common, even as it relates to religious private schools. So that's just a disclaimer that I wanted to throw out there and make sure that you're aware of. I'm happy to help in talking through the decision for you, for your Islamic school, if and when you guys need to do that. But just know that the presentation is going to cover a little bit more broader base and give you guys options as to what you want to do. It's not going to be, there's no one size fits all. It's going to be, every school is going to come up with a unique solution to how to address this issue. And inshallah, you guys will be better equipped to do that once we get through the presentation. I'm trying to make give me 1 second. Let me figure out some of these technical issues. Oh, perfect. Okay. So now I can see all of you guys. Most of you guys aren't on screen, which is totally fine. I'm happy and even encourage video participation. I love seeing bright faces that are ready to learn. But if you want to stay behind your name, that's totally fine too. If you guys have any questions, feel free to shout them out. If there's something wrong with the slides, you can't see it, please do let me know. I've gone through many presentations where I went through like 10 slides and then somebody told me they couldn't even see the first one. So that was terrible. I have my screen up here, so I might be looking up a little bit, but know that I'm talking to you guys. All right, any questions so far? We're good? All right, let us begin. All right, so before we get into the LGBTQ issue, we need to kind of have an understanding of the backdrop of what the context in which this comes forward. And basically, we are living, obviously, in the United States with the American legal system. And the American legal system, alhamdulillah, actually provides a lot of protections that you may not see in other countries. So your ability to even practice your religion freely is obviously unique when compared to other countries around the world. The basic principle that American law goes by is that First Amendment within the U.S. Constitution, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that actually is two clauses. One is the establishment clause, and then the other is the free exercise clause. And basically what it's saying is that the government cannot promote one religion over another, and it cannot restrict individuals' religious practices, including the religious practices of the collective, meaning Islamic schools or private schools, even Christian schools, Jewish schools, whatever it may be. So the right is all-encompassing. Now, as time has kind of evolved, as society has evolved, society has become increasingly more and more progressive. And the right, the freedom of religion right, started to get diluted as the Supreme Court started deciding case after case after case. And you can see this in other contexts as well. Namely, the women's rights to abortion kind of thing. That was a faux pas. It was completely outside of society when we were talking, in the 50s and 60s. In the 30s and 40s, an abortion was crazy. It was not even something, is unfathomable. But now, ever since Roe v. Wade, that has completely changed. And so essentially what was happening to the freedom of religion also, that was becoming more and more diluted. The freedom of religion, since it's a constitutional amendment, it is a fundamental right within the American legal system. As it was getting more diluted in the employment context, meaning employees were not given the ability it was a questionable right, meaning it wasn't an absolute anymore. So your religious practices became questionable, and employees could fire you even if you had a strong religious belief. So basically in 1993, the federal legislature, meaning the U.S. House of Representatives, they passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that was actually passed in response to a case which basically diluted the freedom of religion right, diluted the ability for an individual to protect his religious liberties. So essentially what Congress said at that time is that government, whenever they're trying to regulate something that would affect religious freedom, they must have a compelling government interest, and they must enact laws that are narrowly tailored to do so. So when you're looking at the spectrum of rights, there are rights that are given fundamental status, and the religious right is a fundamental status. So whenever a government makes a law regulating that, they need to do it very narrowly, and they need to do it, and they need to be advancing a compelling interest to do so. That is all constitutional law, and it's a lot of theory, and it's kind of hard to apply. But I've given you two examples here, and hopefully that gives a little bit of clarity. So there are certain compelling government interests that outweigh religious freedom, and there are certain ones that don't. The Hobby Lobby case, if you guys remember a few years ago now, 7 years ago now, Hobby Lobby as an employer, after the Affordable Care Act was passed, the Affordable Care Act has provisions in it which require employers to provide contraceptives to their employees, or contraceptive care, basically medical care. They require that the employer provide that to the employee. Hobby Lobby is a private employer, much like yourselves, and they said that that goes against our religious grounds. We don't believe in contraceptives, so therefore we do not want to participate in the Affordable Care Act. And that actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, even as a private entity, you guys have a religious freedom not to be regulated in an area where your rights, your religious freedoms would be infringed, or your religious beliefs would be infringed. So basically, the court said, Hobby Lobby, you do not have to provide that Affordable Care Act contraceptive medicine to your employees because it goes against your religious liberties. So that actually, for private schools, that's a great decision, because that is expanding the rights and providing contraceptives, even if against somebody's religion, then you don't have to do that because it infringes on a religious belief. So great. But there are compelling government interests that religious freedom and religious belief cannot overcome, meaning that the government can regulate those interests. And that second example hopefully illustrates that. So religious discrimination cannot be justified. So religious discrimination, because of the United States history of slavery and all of the atrocities that have happened in this country with regards to race, they believe that race discrimination is a compelling enough interest that even somebody's religious belief cannot overcome. So what happened in Bob Jones University versus the United States, Bob Jones University essentially had a religious belief that they would be able to exclude African Americans, for example, or Jewish people, for example. And they essentially sued the United States government saying, we don't have to comply with this. And the United States government said, no. The racial discrimination is such a bedrock issue that government needs to be able to regulate. And the US Supreme Court, again, in 1983, they decided that, yes, that is a compelling enough issue, a compelling enough interest that it needs to be able to be regulated by the US government. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more clarity. What this slide is really intended to do is give you an idea of how highly regarded religious freedom is in this country and how highly protected Islamic schools are within that context. But again, as society is progressing, as case law is going forward, there's always a risk that right will become diluted, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So those two are the big laws, and then the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that was actually passed in 2000, because governments, local governments especially in the South, were putting ambiguous zoning restrictions on Islamic schools, on mosques. That became a law so that it could open that back up. And there was actually a famous mosque that actually used the rights that act provides to basically establish a mosque, because they could show that the local government was restricting them unnecessarily. and illegally, essentially based on that law. But for our purposes, the LGBTQ purposes, that really is not, that's not going to really play. The first two are going to play more. Okay. Now, with the backdrop of the anti-discrimination laws within our country. So you have the religious freedom on one level, but then you still have anti-discrimination laws, discrimination laws that protect, namely, a lot of times Muslims for being discriminated against. I want to make one point clear here. Whenever I say LGBTQ, that goes across the gambit. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and that Q is sometimes questioning or it's sometimes queer. But whenever we're talking about this, know that sexual orientation and transgender status, those are two different things actually. But for purposes of this presentation, we're going to combine them. And you'll know why just in a second, based on the case that that basically has given rights to both. So Title VII is the main federal anti-discrimination law that is relied upon by almost everybody, when they are trying to fight discrimination, or if they don't get hired, for example, or somebody is discriminating against them at work, or somebody is harassing them based on the color of their skin, or based on their religion, or based on their sexual status. So what Title VII says is that it is an unlawful employment practice to discriminate against any individual with respect to compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. So basically, any part of your employment relationship because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So basically, that covers almost anything that you can, any uniqueness in a person you can cover with Title VII. Now, up until this past summer, that did not include transgender status. In some courts, it included sexual orientation. But this summer, the U.S. Supreme Court on June 15th, 2020, they had a case, Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. And Bostock was an employee who was transgender and homosexual. And the county government, the Clayton County government, discriminated against him and essentially fired him because of those statuses. And that case went all the way up through the court system to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said now Title VII does include sexual orientation, meaning homosexual or lesbian or whatever, and transgender status. So now those two things are protected by Title VII. So basically what it means is that now private employers with 15 or more employees cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation or transgender status. So obviously, even within that case, what happens is the parties file briefs, and then there are third parties that are allowed to file briefs because it may affect them too. They call those amicus briefs. When amicus briefs were filed, there were a lot of private employers, especially religious institutions, saying, hey, listen, if you let this in, meaning if you make this a protected class, then you're really going to affect us because it goes against our religion. But even then, the court did say, no, it's going to be protected because there are certain exceptions that religious institutions can rely on to get out from underneath this Title VII law. And we'll get to that right in the next slides. So Title VII, employment relationship, that's one anti-discrimination law. The second one is Title IX. Title IX actually covers both employment relationship and student relationship, but it is very specific and it only applies to schools that receive federal financial assistance. Now, given the range of Islamic schools that we have, you may or may not receive federal financial assistance. And if you do, then Title IX does apply to you. But again, there are exceptions within Title IX for religious institutions, which we will get to in a second. So this is the backdrop. This is essentially the rights that the LGBTQ community relies on when saying that private employers, public employers, nobody can discriminate against us. But there are exceptions to these rules, which I will go over. One thing that I do want to disclaim here, I should have had my disclaimers in bright red, but one thing that I do want to disclaim here is this is not the entire world of laws out there, okay? It far from it, in fact. I can probably say that there's even federal laws out there that I have not put on here that may apply. But generally speaking, in terms of federal law, these are the two big ones. The real kicker here is state and local laws. Those sometimes are even more strict. Those sometimes are even more strict than the federal laws. And since we have people all across the country, I won't get into that, but know this, like a state law, for example, like the Illinois School Code, where I'm housed, the Illinois School Code and the Illinois Human Rights Act, they both have provisions that explicitly say that you cannot discriminate against transgender people or people of a different sexual orientation. So when we talk about the exceptions, we're talking about federal law exceptions. We haven't covered the state law exceptions. So whenever you're dealing with this issue, you have to make sure that you have a local attorney within your state that can help guide you, because there may be state laws and local rules like executive orders from mayors that apply that we haven't covered here. And unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to do all those, one, because I'm not licensed in all the states that you guys are in, but two, it's going to be way too much material at that point. And actually, I would be curious, even if you guys could put it into the chat, where your guys' Islamic schools are. That way I can at least kind of get a gleaning of where you guys are and where your communities are and what states you live in, because some states are much more progressive. Example, New York, California, Illinois, and some states are much more conservative. Example, Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, those kinds of states. So if you guys even want to throw that into the chat, that would be beneficial information for me. I'll pause here, and we're already at half an hour. I apologize. I'll pause here and let me know if there are any questions. Throw those into the chat as well. I'll give you guys just a second. Let me get a drink of water and then we'll move on. Okay, we got all over the place. I like it. Okay. Minnesota, Orange County, California, Maryland, Los Angeles. All right, okay. All over the place. Washington State, Boston, mashallah. Okay, let me speed this up a little bit, guys. Sorry. Okay, so we got the backdrop now. Hopefully everybody is clear. Hopefully I'm explaining this in a way that this is a very complex area. In fact, there's a lot of nuance in here. So if there's ever any confusion, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up, please. Okay. So the real meat of the bone right here. These are the exceptions. So when you talk about exceptions, there are statutory exceptions and there are case law exceptions. So the way that the American legal system works is that in the statute itself, when they write the statute, they put in exceptions in there for religious institutions. So we'll go through a statutory exception, and then there's also case law exceptions. So in the American legal system, whenever a law is written, whenever there's ambiguity about that law, two parties will come together and they will basically sue each other, and then they will try to get the courts to decide how to interpret that law. So when I talked about the Clayton County case, that was an interpretation of Title VII, and that became law because of the US Supreme Court. And that's how our system governs. So you have statutory law, which we have to follow, but the courts have the ability to interpret that, and that also becomes an extension of the law. So that's why lawyers, they not only have to look at the statute, but they also have to look at the case law in the American system, okay? So when we're talking about a statutory exception, there's a religious organization exception to Title VII. So the Title VII law that exception is actually codified. And those 42 USC 2000 numbers that you guys see, that is actually the citation. So if you put that into Google, you'll be able to actually see the text of the law that exempts religious institutions and religious schools. But note that these exceptions only allow for religious schools to hire staff of the same faith. They do not accept you or exempt you from other Title VII protections, namely sexual orientation and namely LGBTQ, basically. They do not exempt from that. And even then, whenever you qualify for this, to qualify for this, you have to show that the purpose and character of your religious school is primarily religious. So, for example, if your religious institution, your religious school said, we're only going to hire Muslims, and a Jewish person applies and says, hey, I want to work at this school, and you say, no, we're only hiring Muslims, we have a religious organization exception. He can still sue you and say, hey, do you meet the requirements? And the requirements that you would have to meet in court are the 4 that I have listed right there. Whether your articles of incorporation show a religious purpose, whether your day-to-day operations are religious, if you don't pray in school, or if you don't do salat or dua or anything like that, then your operations are not necessarily religious, whether you're a nonprofit, and whether you're affiliated, supported by, or just generally speaking, a religious organization. Generally speaking, most religious schools, most Islamic schools will meet those criteria. So I'm not necessarily worried about that. And that's not our main topic, but that's just for context. That's one statutory exception. Now, this is the main one. This also, when I was talking about how this area of law has evolved, it literally evolved in 2020 during the pandemic. Like I told you, that Bostock case, it was from June of 2020. And then there was a July case in 2020 also talking about this same stuff. So teachers employed by religious schools who perform a religious role in the course of their employment do not qualify for civil rights protection. So they do not qualify for the Title VII discrimination protection that Title VII gives. They do not qualify for that. They do not qualify for age protection from age. There's age discrimination laws and there's disability discrimination laws. They do not qualify for those. And we know that because they've had those protections, they had those exceptions in the past through case law. But in 2020, the conservative US Supreme Court, they expanded that case law. They expanded that legal principle. And what that legal principle now says is essentially, before they had a very unique test to determine whether an employee was actually a ministerial employee. So the way that this started was, hey, religious schools, your ministers, they can't claim discrimination protection. They can't claim discrimination under Title VII. And that made sense. But essentially what was happening as the case law evolved, as time went on, the ministerial exception became narrower and narrower and narrower, and they had a test for it. But basically, now that there's a conservative US Supreme Court that really believes in religious rights and religious freedoms, they expanded that. But the downside of this, the kicker here, is that unfortunately, we don't know how this test now applies. So essentially what happened is Morrissey, Baru, and there was another case actually that was combined with this. They essentially were denied, some liberties. I think it was actually based on pregnancy. They were fired because they had become pregnant and they were teaching at a Catholic school. So what the school did was, hey, listen, you just, violated our religious beliefs by having something, that by engaging in conduct that is against our religious beliefs. So we have the ability to terminate you. And what the employee essentially did was, hey, no, Title VII protects me, and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, that's a federal law that protects me from this. And the school said, no. You were a ministerial employee, meaning you taught religious things, and therefore you were exempted from those protections, meaning we can still fire you because you violated a religious belief. Now, what the court basically said, the court usually tries to give you factors for a test. But what the court did here was completely opposite of that. The court basically says, you know, what matters at bottom is what an employee does. That's great for Islamic schools because it's such ambiguous language, but now that ambiguous language has to be applied through more and more case law. So unfortunately, we don't really know what that means yet. But all we know is that if a religious school employee is religious in nature or essentially performs a religious function or a vital religious role, then they cannot claim protections of Title VII. So now what we don't know, because this case is so new, what we don't know is how that will apply to our different classes of employees. Will that apply to teachers? Probably. And how will Islamic schools protect against that? They will have to put things in their employee handbooks. They will have to put things in their job descriptions to give proof that these employees are inherently religious in nature. They perform a religious function. And we will get to that in a second. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys right now. So those teachers, we have to show, when we get sued, we have to show that our teachers perform an inherently religious function, or they perform a religious function or a vital religious role. And we'll go through how to do that, how to prepare their evidence to the extent that that's how you want to deal with the LGBTQ issue. Now, what's really going to be the kicker is, you know, will that apply to teachers? Probably, because they teach, they actually interact with students and they are imparting religious knowledge. But will that necessarily apply to administrators, like the leadership of your schools? Probably. Will that apply to staff, like administrative staff? Will that apply to custodial staff? That's an iffy question. Of course, our religious schools, our Islamic schools will make that argument. And the argument essentially would be that, hey, listen, even our staff, they are religious role models and they need to act in accordance with the Islamic faith. Then yeah, you might be able to get away with it. But this is not it's not gonna prevent you from being sued. This is still an evolving area of case law. So hopefully that made sense. If that really didn't, please speak up. I want to make sure that you guys have understood the ministerial exception, because that's really what Islamic schools are going to be relying on. And I'm going to show you how to do that when we come to the practical steps of this. I'm just going to look through. I'm gonna call you out, Sister Tamina. I hope I'm saying that right. She has an Islamic school located in Illinois. She said, when we did schools recognition with the Illinois School Board of Education, which is ISB, we created job descriptions based on exceptions, which the review team accepted. Like we added for secular subjects curriculum linked to Quran and Hadith. It helped. That is really good. That's exactly what Islamic schools need to do to show that their teachers and their staff are inherently religious in nature, and therefore they cannot sue the Islamic school for discrimination purposes, especially when we're talking about LGBTQ. And that is really the kicker here. The LGBTQ community, sometimes they go into more progressive states that have more progressive laws, like Illinois, like California, and they will sue a school. They'll try to gain employment, get fired, or not even be hired, and they'll sue just to see if they can challenge the school's policies and they can get a court to rule in their favor. And as our society is evolving, as our society is changing over time, this issue of LGBTQ has infiltrated or permeated within the Muslim community. And there are now, just like now there are Catholics who want to be recognized as homosexual and they want to work in Catholic schools, the Muslim community is not far behind that. I know that because I've seen examples of it already. So it's definitely an issue that we have to address, and something that's going to get pretty thorny coming up down the line. Okay, no questions. I gave you guys a chance, okay? If you guys don't understand something, well, you're always going to be able to email me, but I want to make sure you guys understand so that you guys get, because it always builds on top of each other. So we talked about Title VII. We talked about one statutory exception, one case law exception, the ministerial exception, which is what we're generally going to rely on. Now, for the student context, there's Title IX. Again, Title IX does not apply if you don't receive federal funds. So if you don't receive federal funds, you can take a nice step back, relax, take a deep breath, and you don't have to pay attention to me for probably the next 2 minutes. But if you do accept federal financial assistance, there are still ways to exempt yourself from those protections. So essentially what Title IX says is that any school that receives federal financial assistance cannot discriminate based on sex in any educational program, okay? So when we talk about students, if we're not letting students in because they're LGBTQ, then that means that we've discriminated against them based on their status, right? But there are exemptions to that. So that second bullet point, it is not applicable to educational institutions controlled by a religious organization or that are religious in nature, which you have to show, to the extent Title IX would be inconsistent with the religious tenets of the organization. So if you can show Islamic school, your Islamic school is inconsistent with LGBTQ, which generally speaking, I think we would all agree that it is, then you can be also exempted from this. So meaning if a teacher is actually able to sue you under Title IX as well. If a teacher sues you, or if a student sues you for discriminating against them, not letting them into the school, or while they're in the school being harassed based on their LGBTQ status, you can say, no, Title IX exception, we qualify. So the Title IX is actually administered by the Department of Education. The Department of Education, there's an Office of Civil Rights, and they are the ones that kind of investigate all of the claims of Title IX, amongst others. Religious organizations can actually get an assurance from the Department of Education that they are exempt, but it is not required. And if you're asking me as an attorney, I would say you don't need to go out and proactively try to get that exemption. Why? Because if you're basically saying, hey, listen, I'm in Islamic school, I'm likely to discriminate, can you please give me an exemption? You're basically kind of like flashing the lights and saying, hey, listen, Department of Education, look at me. I'm a school that receives federal financial assistance, and I probably plan to discriminate against based on sex. If you don't do that application, then they don't know, right? So it's probably better that you don't apply for it, but you definitely can. It's not required by any law, so you don't have to do it. But you can if you want that assurance. But that, again, is a unique decision for your board, for your school as administrators that you want to decide. If you want help with that, of course, happy to do so. It's there's pretty simple forms on, there's a pretty simple way through the Department of Education, but you have to show a number of things. One, you're going to have to show your religious rulings on LGBTQ, and you're going to have to show that you're a religious organization, and you got to make sure that those things are buttoned up before you ever do that. So if you do want to do that, it's not required. If you do want to do that, make sure that those things are buttoned up before you go and do that application. I haven't heard any laughs, and that's totally fine, but please do take a moment to appreciate these cartoons, okay? I really, really took a long time in selecting these so that you guys would be chuckling in the background while I'm explaining this very, very serious topic. But
Brother Muhammad, I just wanted to explain to you that we asked them to stay mute and off camera. So
okay, that's fine. No, that's fine. Yeah, I know. That's
so
me.
they're probably laughing and falling out of their chairs when they see this.
I'm sure that water has come out of noses already. Somebody has fallen out of the chair. I know that they're hilarious, but you can compliment me on them in the chat if you so choose. But I'm not going to make it's not a requirement for the presentation. Okay. Where are we at on time? I am completely losing track. Okay, 4:45. All right, great. Okay. So now I want you to know these blue slides, they're a different color because now we've come to the practical side of all of this. I explained to you the theory. You guys are probably all asleep. Now wake up. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is what you guys need to do when addressing this LGBTQ issue. And it's bright blue, so hopefully it woke you up too. Okay? So now we're going to get into how we deal with this LGBTQ issue on your level. Okay. So what's going to happen is you are essentially saying that we qualify for an exemption to these anti-discrimination laws. And if and when you get sued, or if and when somebody challenges that, you will have to present evidence in court saying that you qualify for those, meaning that you are inherently religious, meaning that your employees do vital religious roles. They impart religious knowledge. So to qualify for that, you can't just say that and it's not backed up anywhere. You always got to put it in writing. So to do that, what we would need to do is Islamic schools would need to take a look at their key documents, especially their corporate charters, their facility use policies, their admissions policies, their employee handbooks, their employee contracts, if you guys have those. And you guys got to make sure that those documents have a lot of evidence showing that you guys are an inherently Islamic school. You guys teach Islam, your daily practices involve Islam, and that your employees and your students must be committed to living an Islamic lifestyle, if that's what you want to do. So each school, again, is going to be different. How you want to address this, some schools are going to want to have a strict ban, like, hey, it's black and white, no go, never. Even employees cannot be engaging in this. Students cannot be engaging in this. We're not going to teach about it. We are 100% Islamic. I can imagine situations, and again, remember my disclaimer, I'm not advocating for anything. I'm not giving you any religious rulings. I'm just merely kind of talking through the practical implications of all this. There are going to be certain schools, certain Islamic schools that for practical reasons cannot take such a tough stance. And please, again, don't bring the torches to me. I'm not saying that we need to conform to this. I'm not saying that we need to allow for this behavior. We need to allow for this sin to happen. Not saying that at all. But practically speaking, certain Islamic schools, they may not be able to get all Muslim teachers. They may need to go outside of their faith and get other Islamic teachers, or get other teachers that serve in the Islamic school. I know for a fact that in Illinois, I've had friends who are not in the Islamic faith serve as teachers. So there are going to be practical implications of this, that if you take a hard stance, then you might be running out of employees because some of the employees may not want to work for you, or you may not be able to give them a job based on your policies. And I will say this, there's nothing greater that a court will smack down than a policy that is not followed. If a policy is not followed and not consistently applied, they're just going to throw it right back in your face and say, hey, listen, you're an Islamic school, you say this, but you have all these teachers doing all of these things. Or for example, you have a teacher that's, out of wedlock. So you're not following it all the way. So why should I treat this LGBTQ teacher different? Or why should I treat this LGBTQ student differently? So that is something to really consider here. So I'm going to show you what kinds of statements we need to have in those revised key documents. But in addition to that, make sure you train your staff, train your volunteers. They need to know the policies that you guys have, that the Islamic school have. And a lot of times what we say is that even staff should sign off on abiding by those policies, meaning within your employee policy, you're going to have saying, hey, listen, you're going to be acting as an Islamic role model and you're going to be living your life by Islamic values. And if you violate any of that, then we have the ability to terminate you. And a lot of the schools can have them sign off on that. A lot of at-will employees, even in the private sector, they have them sign off on employment policies. They do that for a reason. Why? Because when they get sued, if they get sued, inshallah it doesn't happen, but when they get sued or if they get sued, then the employee says, hey, listen, you discriminated against me. And then the employer says, hey, listen, you signed this. You said there was an employment policy. You said you were going to live your life by Islam. And you said you agreed to us being able to discipline you if you don't, and you signed off. So here you go, Exhibit A. You can't sue us anymore. So that's why. But apply those policies consistently. And that's really where it gets tricky. If you have other employees violating other tenets of Islam, then it makes your case weaker. And so, again, based on practicality, sometimes you may not be able to get away with that. You might not have enough teachers then for your school. Hopefully, inshallah, you do, but that's a practical implication that you got to think through. And then always, again, we're talking on the federal level here. There's always a state level and there's a local level. And those laws can be different. They can be even more stringent than the federal level laws. So you got to make sure you consult an attorney in your local state. I'm always able to help you guys and talk to you guys about federal stuff, but I'm only licensed in Illinois. So for those people who have schools in Illinois, lucky you get to talk to me. But for those people who don't, you got to make sure that you touch base with those people as well. Touch base with attorneys in your local state. Okay, I'll give you another shot for questions. Please do let me know. Put them in the chat if you can. We're at 5 o'clock. Sister Layla, we have until 5:30, or we have another half an hour, correct? 40 minutes.
Is that right, Brother Fuad?
Yes, we're at 2:52 Pacific Standard Time, so we have another 40 minutes approximately.
40 minutes, okay, perfect. All right, great. We're right on time. We're right on time. All right, okay. So revision to foundational documents. I try to make these, again, I didn't include specific statements because, again, each school is going to vary. Each school is going to differ as to how hard they want to hit these statements, how hard they want to change, how much emphasis they want to put on this LGBTQ issue, okay? So revise documents to include theological beliefs. Theological beliefs meaning, hey, we live our lives according to Islamic values. Our school's purpose is Islamic in nature. We try to teach on Islamic values, and we want to teach our children to grow up being devout Muslims or being role model Muslims. Things like that baked into your foundational documents, like your Articles of Incorporation or your Constitution, that will help. Religious authority, this is a big one. So, if your Constitution or your Articles of Incorporation says we go by the Islamic faith, but it doesn't specify the specific sect of Islam that you may be, or a specific religious authority, then your religious belief then can be questioned by the courts. It has the ability to be questioned by the courts. Usually courts don't stray into that. But obviously, as an attorney, I wouldn't want to even open up that possibility. What I would want you to do is say in your bylaws, hey, we follow this Islamic sect, or we are Islamic, and our religious authority, we get all of our rulings from such and such imam, or such and such, our governing board. And our governing board has an imam, and he gives edicts about this, or he gives us our religious authority. So when it comes to the LGBTQ issue, we asked our masjid's imam, and he said that this is not allowed based on this religious doctrine, based on these Islamic doctrines, based on this Quranic ayat, based on this hadith. It is not allowed, and therefore we do not allow it. So that having that in there is very, very important. So those two big things. Dispute resolution is kind of an optional one. So usually religious schools don't want to end up in court because court is generally secular. But if you have a dispute resolution, meaning, listen, if we ever come into conflict about our Articles of Incorporation, we are going to go to such and such imam, or we are going to go to such and such arbitrator. Having those in there will save you from going to court and going there, because if an employee sues and says, hey, listen, court, I want you to decide this issue, you're going to point to your articles of incorporation and say, hey, listen, we have an alternative dispute resolution. We are not supposed to be here. You need to kick this case out. We need to go to our arbitrator. That needs to go there. Hopefully that makes sense.
Brother Muhammad, there are a couple of questions just because this is really specific and this is really important for our schools. There was a question about religious authority, even though the Sister Mona said got it. Some schools are not associated with a masjid and may not have a religious scholar. Would having guiding principles like that we base our beliefs on the text of the Quran and the prophetic tradition, and then listing maybe some very specific belief systems.
Yes.
And then would that suffice?
That would suffice as long as you can be assured that any issue that you deal with, you can find in those texts that you are, so the issue of LGBTQ, that's kind of an easy one, right? There are Quranic verses that prohibit it, right? So it's not going to be a hard one to say that it doesn't. But, there are, like abortion, for example. I'm sure that there are hadiths out there. I'm sure that there are texts out there that we can refer to. But generally speaking, those kinds of issues that you're going to look in the text and implicitly take a ruling from, having a religious authority saying, hey, listen, this imam, he tells us, and he said no, right? So it just kind of buttons it up a little bit more. But yes, you are able to just go towards Quranic, just say Quran and these books of hadith that we have. You can do that.
But it sounds like you're recommending that schools have a scholar or a person, a religious authority that we say, this is who we turn to for guidance, and this is what they say.
I would say recommend is a strong word. I would say that whenever we talk about risks, as an attorney, whenever I talk about risks, it's always a continuum of risk, okay? When you want to guard against that risk, I'm giving you belt and suspenders. I'm saying, hey, Quran, get those religious texts and say that there's an imam or a governing board that you refer to for religious rulings. That's belt and suspenders. Now, if you just did belt, you're still protected. Your pants are not going to fall off, hopefully, but you may be a little bit less protected. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Sorry, we're just going off. It's been an hour now. But it's, it's not as great of a protection. But again, that decision to refer to an imam, it depends on your locale too. So a school in Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, where there's generally conservative communities that aren't really going to challenge this, you're probably okay just referring to the Quran and Hadith. But if you're in Illinois, California, there are people who will there are organizations like nonprofit organizations that will try to sue you just so that they can change the law. And in those cases, I'd probably say, hey, listen, maybe belt and suspenders is a little more appropriate. Does that answer your question?
It does. That's very helpful. And then the other question is, does this information need to be in the handbooks as well? Because you have a list of documents that we should include it in. Well,
I'm glad that you mentioned that. Now we've gotten over here, I will say this, in the bylaws and constitution, again, going on that risk continuum that I talked about, you can have general statements to Quran and your Islamic rulings, or you can have specific statements about homosexuality, about marriage, about gender identity. You can have those specific statements in there. But again, when you do have those specific statements, make sure that you address all the issues that you may deal with. And that's kind of hard. That's why I usually say, kind of leave it a little bit general and point to a religious authority or point to Islamic books. But if you do make specific statements about LGBTQ, then make sure you make specific statements about, children outside of marriage, children outside of wedlock or outside of wedlock. All of those things then have to be addressed as well. So I say you can kind of point to it specifically if that's what your school wants to do, but be cautioned that you'll have to point to a lot of other things as well. Okay, the handbooks and policy documents is the next slide. You led me right to it. Here we go. So now we're talking about employment practices, changes to your employment practices that you need to do. When we're talking about employment practicing, we're relying on that ministerial exception. Remember when we talked about that ministerial exception, we need to show that our staff serve vital religious roles. We need to show that they impart religious knowledge. Like the sister said, that they put in their job description, that's perfect. That's what you need to do. You need to know, you need to put in your job postings, whenever you post a job, you need to make reference to, that this position is going to teach Islamic values, or even make it a requirement that they be Muslim. You're allowed to do that. You need to put in your job descriptions or your employee contracts, whichever one you use. And if you have an employee handbook, I suggest you do. If you don't, it's not the worst thing in the world, especially if you don't have an employee handbook and you have employee contracts, that's okay too. But make sure that they're in those documents saying that this person needs to be a practicing Muslim. Or practicing Muslim may be tough. You may not be able to find teachers that serve as a Muslim role model, meaning you have to abide by the values of Islam, even though you may not be Muslim, and that you can be disciplined for those violation of those Muslim values. That's basically what happened in that Our Lady of Guadalupe case. And that's what we're saying that we need to do. We need to make sure that it's baked in to your employee handbooks, your job postings, your job descriptions, that this person is going to be teaching, imparting Islamic wisdom. So you can say something as general as Muslim role model, or you can button it up even further and say, hey, you need to have knowledge of Quran and Islamic faith. You need to agree to abide by Muslim values, even if you may not be Muslim. Or you need to specifically say, hey, listen, this person is going to lead dua in the morning. They're going to lead afternoon prayers. And, in the afternoon, you're going to lead Zuhur prayers, for example. They're going to be teaching Islamic principles. Even if they may be a math teacher, for example, they're going to tie that in. They're going to tie that into their curriculum and, kind of bake it in so that Islam is in all aspects of the school. Then you really have good evidence to say, hey, listen, we're an Islamic school through and through. Everybody, lives a Muslim role model or is expected to be a Muslim role model, and they impart Islamic wisdom or Islamic knowledge. Okay. I'm hoping that this is good. So we've gone through foundational documents for your organization. That was the last slide. This is for your employment practices, and now we'll go to students. And what am I at? 5:02. Perfect. Okay. I'll try to finish up in the next 10 minutes, and then we will go through question and answer. But I see that there are questions here, so I will address them right now. I know I'm a little bit late, and I apologize for that. With regards to LGBTQ, we also created a curriculum map for the health, sex education state requirements by linking those topics to Islamic studies and physical education lessons in the curriculum maps, and also added tarbiyah workshop topics in the curriculum that were held separately, boys, girls, in which we also covered the LGBTQ for high school students. Could health education limitations also be done in our school policy? Yes. Generally speaking, as long as, if you're going for ISB accreditation, as long as it doesn't violate the accreditation requirements, then yes, you can. And frankly speaking, you don't necessarily have to get accredited. It's something that a school chooses to do. If you want that accreditation, there are going to be certain curriculum requirements that you have to teach, but you can bake the Islamic principles into there, teach them, but then bake the Islamic principles into there. Actually, in fact, Illinois just recently passed a state law requiring the education of LGBTQ history. And now public schools are going to be requiring that, meaning that it is taught. Like, for example, another example that in my day was the Holocaust. The Holocaust had to be taught. And I remember specifically my dad was like, what? Why? Why isn't all the genocide against Muslims taught? Why just the Holocaust? And he read that Anne Frank book that I was required to read, and he was not happy, but it was a law. And now there's an LGBTQ law too. So, if that becomes a requirement for accreditation, then you might have an issue, but you can always stray away from those. But yes, you can. Could health education limitations also be done in our school policy? Yes, they generally can. We would need to go through specifics, but generally speaking, you can do that. Great question. And I actually will, I'm going to try to cut copy it. If there's a person, that was actually a direct message. I'm going to cut copy and paste this stuff, Sister Tamina. This is really good information, and I hope you don't mind me sharing it. If you do mind me sharing it, why don't you give me a thumbs down real fast, and then I won't. But if you don't mind, it's really good information. There's another question. Does this information need to be in handbooks and bylaws? I think I've stated that, and I'll go through that a little bit more. Attendee asks, any case study law on these issues? How did the courts decide? So that's a really, really good question. That's a really good question, and I'll address this. I'll address this now. Oh, I can post that. All right, give me 1 second, guys. I'm going to post this information that the sister presented. It's really good info for all of you guys to see. So let me just do that really fast. It's a long message. Okay, there we go. All right. I'm going to put this to everybody just so you guys can see it. Good information. And then any case law on these issues, how did the courts decide? So really great question. So unfortunately, I won't be able to get into that level of depth, although I'm happy to do that offline and outside of the presentation. The only reason is because we're nationwide. The US Supreme Court is the top court of the nation. Anything that they say applies to the entire nation. Outside of the US Supreme Court, the nation is actually broken up into circuits. I think there's 13 circuits, and each circuit has a different interpretation of law. So like, for example, this Title VII, sometimes the exceptions are a little bit more broad in certain areas, and sometimes they're a little bit more narrow in certain circuits. And then even after that, there's districts. So for example, we live here in Chicago, Illinois, in the Chicagoland area, the Northern District of Illinois. That is where we first go for laws. Of course, the Supreme Court overrides that, and then the Seventh Circuit is our next one, but then the district is the one that also has the ability to interpret laws that we need to follow. And each of you guys, alhamdulillah, you guys are so geographically diverse that a lot of you guys fall into different circuits. So there are cases out there discussing not LGBTQ issues, but religious schools and how they're treated, but they would be circuit dependent. They would be dependent based on where you live. So I couldn't really go into that. What I can say though is that this LGBTQ issue, it was just decided like June of this year. So it's been just over 7 months, where Title VII now includes LGBTQ protection, and the ministerial exception, that case also was from July of this year. So there aren't going to be many cases outside of that. I'm sure that they're on their way through the court system, but they're not there yet. So just so you guys know that. I apologize, I won't be able to, but I'm happy. I'll give you guys my email. It's in the presentation. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to look into it for your particular area, and even the state laws in your area, happy to do so. All right. Okay. All right. Great. All right. I'm going to try to wrap up here in the next 7 minutes. Okay, guys. So admissions policy. We talked about Title IX. Title IX protects against sex-based discrimination, and that would be your LGBTQ. That would fall into that. Again, you can have admissions policies that protect against this. Now, how hard you want to go on this issue? Again, it depends. There may be LGBTQ students, but if they're not raising their voices about it, and you need students, or you want to be able to exercise some humanity, that's really you. Again, not saying anything about religious rulings, not saying anything about condoning this kind of conduct. It really is fact specific. And the harder you go, sometimes in progressive states, the harder those organizations are going to want to try to push back. So when you have just general statements like, hey, we want everybody to live a Muslim lifestyle, that's a general statement. But if you have something that, hey, we do not allow LGBTQ people around here at all. I'm sorry, that's my azan. We do not allow LGBTQ people around here ever. That is going to, in your community, if you're in a progressive community, that might get pushed back harder. Flying under the radar sometimes may be a little bit easier. Again, not saying you hide your Muslim faith, not saying any of that, just saying that the practical decision that you make can be different based on your circumstances and based on the level of risk that you are open to. Okay, so in admissions policies, this is a little bit of a stickier situation because you're basically saying that you're not going to allow students in, and that may be your decision, and you have the ability to do that. But no, that even doing all of these handbook things, all of the employment practices, things that I've talked about, it doesn't make you immune from a lawsuit. It will never make you immune from a lawsuit. Anybody can sue anybody in this country. And just because you have those things in your handbook doesn't mean that somebody can't sue you. It's never going to guarantee that you don't get sued. But having these in there just protects you for the actions that you've taken. So for example, you say, hey, listen, we will never allow an LGBTQ student. So make sure that you don't, it's a lot easier to it's a lot easier to reject students at the gate than expel them after they've come in. Okay, so if you want to not allow it in your schools, make sure that parents and students know about your religious principles and your religious requirements. Your religious requirements and your teachings. Make sure that in your admissions packet there are clear statements about your religious beliefs and what you do. What you do and do not allow, even if that's a general statement. You can even try to get information on father and mother to make sure that they're abiding by that. If you don't want parents that are LGBTQ or parents that are outside of wedlock. Student handbook, just like the employee handbook, make sure that you have information on school's religious mission in your student handbook, not in your bylaws, and in your employee handbook, but in your student handbook as well. And make sure that it says, hey, we are going to be practicing Islamic values here, and violations of those can lead to discipline and can lead to dismissal. So if and when there is a student that, made his way through past your admissions process, then on the back end, you have something in your student handbook that gives you the ability to expel them. Now, the public relations issues that you're going to have to deal with that, I'm not going to get into, but at least you have those at least you have those practical protections in there. So when you do have to stand up to a challenge, whether that be in court or wherever, then you have it baked into your policies. Now, dealing with LGBTQ in the classroom it's more of a teaching thing than a legal thing, than a legal issue. So I'll get into that in a little bit if you guys really have questions about that, but I want to make sure that we leave time, and I have 3 minutes. I really want to get to this next slide, and then we can turn back around to that.
Brother Muhammad, there is a session tomorrow on the LGBTQ and the Islamic position in schools.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right, well, then I'm covered. I'm out. All right, good. All right, great. Let me move on then to the future. Okay, and this is the last slide, and then we can break a little bit and do Q&A, or I have a lot of other stuff. Okay, future of legal protections for Islamic schools. So you guys, most of you probably do not like Donald Trump. Even if you do like Donald Trump, I'm not going to get into the politics of it. He had the ability to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. That's like almost unheard of. And most of the justices that he appointed were conservative. The reason I talk about this is because conservative judges generally lean more towards religious liberties, and they lean more towards individual rights. So they will go out of their way, not out of their way, but they will find legal arguments to protect religious liberties. That includes Islamic schools. So for better or worse, the 3 conservative justices that Donald Trump appointed, they'll generally help Islamic schools, although they may not help in all other aspects of our lives. I understand that, but for Islamic school purposes and for LGBTQ purposes, they might be of help. Amy Coney Barrett is famously, she is actually a trustee at a Catholic school that has anti-LGBTQ and anti-gay policies, and those were completely legal. She wasn't asked about those, but she knew as a trustee of the school that they were legal protections, and she knows, she is actually a constitutional law professor, and she knows federal law very, very well. She's a very, very, very sharp justice. She's a very smart person. Although you may not agree with her political leaning, she's very smart, and she'll generally protect religious liberties. That includes Islamic schools byproduct. I know that you may think that she's not doing it for Islamic schools, and you're right. You're probably right. She's doing it for her own Catholic schools or Christian schools, but as a nice little byproduct, you get that protection too. So those conservative justices will help. But again, like I said a little bit before, I want to really emphasize this. There is these laws and these protections that you have, these exemptions, they will always be challenged. There is no guarantee that somebody is not going to sue you. You just have to do whatever you can do to protect against a lawsuit. And that is by revising your foundational documents, doing the employment practices liability, doing the employment practices changes that we talked about, doing the admissions stuff that we talked about, addressing this LGBTQ issue in your foundational documents, and making sure you train your staff, making sure you apply your policies consistently. All of that is going to be really important. But again, that doesn't protect you from lawsuit. Anybody can sue you. So having insurance against those kinds of things, there are employment practices liability insurance, and you can bake coverage into that so that it doesn't cost the Islamic school a fortune. Or having a very competent attorney doesn't, in your state and local jurisdictions, finding an attorney that you can rely on when these issues come to pass, not necessarily hiring them at the get-go. I know that Islamic schools and private schools are having a difficult time with a lot of different things right now, and that's totally fine. But just knowing that it's there, just having a person that you've identified that can help you in this situation, because when an emergency hits the fan, and it's basically like if you don't have an attorney, it's having an emergency and not knowing the number to dial. At least you know the number to dial. When you have an emergency, when this issue comes to your doorstep and there's reporters and there's a case and you receive papers, at least 911, hey, I got an attorney, I know who to call. I would say if you do nothing else, at least do that, do the foundational stuff, talk to your boards about that, address this issue proactively so that you don't get caught on the heels of your feet. You're on your toes, and have an attorney. Know who you're going to call when this stuff does. What can Islamic schools do? Monitor legislation for sure. An attorney can help you with that. There are other ways. I'm happy to help you with that. That's free of charge. That's not something that I would even take money for. It's something that I do as a service for you guys. It's really important to know the political process. And now you guys probably know why school districts have lobbyists. They have lobbyists because they need to be able to affect laws. They need to be able to get into their representatives' ears so that they can affect policy. And if to the extent that your articles of incorporation allow it, to the extent that your organization, however it's chartered, if you can get into the political realm, try to do that. If you have the funds, of course, there's a lot more complexities that come with that. But we are happy. I'm happy to help. I know that we have, and somebody just posted in here, CISNA is advocacy is a big piece. That's alhamdulillah. That's really, really great. CISNA CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, that's a big one. There are organizations out there that will help you with these issues. So to the extent that you want to get involved, or your governing board says, hey, listen, we need to get out in front of this rather than be caught on our heels, do those things. Make sure that those foundational documents are revised. You've addressed this issue as a board. And then also make sure you contact these organizations and see what you can do. See what your Islamic school can do to help with this stuff. Okay. I am done with the LGBTQ portion. I talked a lot. I apologize if something went over your head. I'm happy to answer questions. I know we have 10 minutes. I have like 20 more slides left, or 15 more slides left about if you guys want to hear about, if you guys don't have questions and you guys have vaccination questions, ADA questions, I have slides on that. I'm happy to present that, or I'll just take your questions in the chat. Sister Layla, I'll let you take over and give me a break.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That's really valuable information. The one question that did come up is about what happens in the classroom. I think I may have diverted the attention about tomorrow's session that deals with like the Islamic components, but legally, what are student rights when it comes to if they bring up their sexuality and in school, what should teachers not do or do in the administration? Kind of.
Yeah. So let's say, we can only really deal with this in a hypothetical scenario. So let's say, there's a student in the 7th grade or the 8th grade and stands up and says, hey, listen, I'm homosexual and you guys should recognize me, or I'm homosexual and I identify as that. Now, if your student handbook has policies about that, then you have the ability to discipline him or her based on her statements. You do. Can you expel them? Probably. Would you just discipline them and say, hey, listen, we understand. We're not saying based on this school's religious beliefs, you're not allowed to practice that. Don't practice it openly. You can discipline, you can expel, but that's assuming that you have that baked into your student handbook. Now, when it comes to the teacher, again, I'm not a teacher, nor would I, delve into this scenario other than to say, legally speaking, I probably wouldn't say, hey, listen, sit down, shut up, and get out of class. I would probably tell the teacher, hey, listen, I heard you. Let's talk about this after class. Let's make sure that we address it after class. And then that's when the teacher knows if this kind of thing happens, that the teacher should know, and this is where the training comes in. The teacher should know, hey, listen, I need to talk to the principal right away. I have this LGBTQ issue. A student says that they're LGBTQ and they want protection, or they want to start a student club, or they just blurted it out in class. I need to get to the next level, and I need to let my principal know so that we can start dealing with this issue. Islamic studies teachers teaching on this topic, they will say, you can definitely say what your Islamic principles are. And you don't have to be a religious scholar to say Islam doesn't allow it. You're totally okay as a private school. You're totally okay in teaching that Islam doesn't allow it. Now, what the students say in response, that's really the key. And a 12, 13, 14-year-old, they say a lot of things. You just need to train your teachers as to how to deal with it. I wouldn't necessarily, because we wouldn't be able to go through all the different scenarios, I would just say, train your teachers to be weary of that, and train your teachers to say, hey, listen, I heard you. Let's talk about it after class. And then get your principal involved, and then now get parents involved. Start having those meetings and say, hey, listen, these are our handbook documents. You agreed to this. What are we going to do? Try to have, if you're going towards the discipline route, I may even suggest sitting down with the parents, sitting down with the student, and having a meeting about, listen, this is where we are. This is where our Islamic school teaches. This is what we do. This is where you're at. We understand. What can we do? Do you want to stay in the school? Do you want to rather go to a public school? Would you, you can suspend them if you want. You can suspend them, and that will create an example. Hey, listen, he said these things. He's suspended, but he came back to school. He's not going to talk about it again. Maybe that's how your Islamic school wants to deal with it. Maybe after talking to the parents and all of that. Maybe, hey, it's a hard line. You talked about this. You're out. You're done. Expelled. That's fine. Again, each school is going to be different because each school is going to be talking about, okay, well, public relations. What's the community going to do? What's the broader community going to do? Are you going to end up in the Chicago Tribune? Are you going to end up in a nationally televised segment on how you are terribly anti-gay and terribly anti-LGBTQ? Are you okay with that? Some Islamic schools may be. A lot of the Islamic schools I know would rather fly under the radar and kind of deal with this outside of the public. Do you want to be sued? If you take a hard line, sometimes you can be sued. Again, I'm not trying to say that I condone this. I'm not telling you Islamic rulings. I'm just saying, practically speaking, how much of a legal bill and how much of a PR bill do you want? If you want to take a hard line, hey, I'll happily take your attorney's fees, but it may be easier to kind of, resolve this by having meetings and, kind of coming to a mediated or alternate dispute resolution method rather than going straight to court, that kind of thing. I hope I answered your question. Does that kind of give you an idea at least?
Yes, it does. Thank you. If there are any other specific questions, everyone feel free to ask now, specifically about this.
Or anything else, I'm sure. I don't know how much we can cover in 6 minutes. I truly, truly apologize. Hey, hold on one second. Let me get to the page with my email. This is all the beautiful stuff that I had for you guys. The ADA and COVID-19. It was amazing. Vaccination, that's a really big one. There's my email. There's our Twitter handle. There's our firm website. Feel free anytime. Anytime. You can be from LA. You can be from Maryland. Doesn't matter. There are now a lot of alhamdulillah, Our Muslim community nationwide has advanced so much that we have a lot of Muslim bar associations in each major city. We have nationwide networks of Muslim attorneys that deal with these kinds of issues or that can be helped in dealing with these kinds of issues. I'm happy to refer you to somebody in your locale. I'm happy to talk to you about whatever questions you may have. Feel free to take down my email. I would love any thoughts about the presentation. Happy to hear them. And feel free to visit our website. You know, education is a lot on Twitter in Illinois. That's my Twitter handle. We post stuff about education. Happy to do anything. If you guys want to see, I'll put up, I got 5 minutes. Any questions, feel free to ask. I'll put up this vaccination thing just to give you guys a teaser if you guys want. I'll give you a minute, maybe 2 minutes. Hopefully you guys aren't asleep. And
you want
guys
to go through this slide? This is really important. This is what we're all dealing with now. Do you want to just go through this?
I'd get you guys. I knew if I threw that bait out there, I'd get you guys. Okay. We may go a little long though. Okay, Sister Layla, you implicitly gave me permission to go long. Okay. I have 4 minutes. It's going to take more than 4 minutes for this slide though. Okay. Ready? Vaccination. Okay. You guys have been dealing with these issues a lot. I'm not even going to get into what you guys are doing right now, what kind of medical accommodations you guys have been giving. I had all of that stuff, but they only gave me an hour and a half. I didn't know that wouldn't be enough for me. But vaccination. Okay. Vaccination. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. You know, it's a very good thing that the vaccination is here. Inshallah, we'll be rid of this COVID pandemic, and that's what everybody wants. But can vaccination be required? This PowerPoint, that EEOC guidance, that's actually a link. That link, if you click on it, and I can send this to anybody, just email me, I'll send you the PowerPoint. That link will lead you to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That is the federal agency that deals with employment laws. And they have basically said that given certain circumstances, if certain conditions are met, that you can require your employees to get a vaccine. You can. You are allowed to require them. But there are 3 really big buts in there. One, if they have a disability that makes it difficult for them or would threaten their life or give them some sort of, side effect, then you may have to accommodate them. The religious accommodations is an easy one. Well, it's not an easy one. There are a lot of, I've seen a variety of religious rulings on this vaccine stuff. I have seen Muslim startup groups saying this is against our religious rights. And you may have to deal with that. But suffice it to say, the short story is vaccine can be required, but big buts. Disability accommodation, if an employee comes to you and says, hey, listen, I have diabetes and my doctor said that getting this vaccine could put me in cardiac arrest or put me in stroke or something like that, then we need to think about accommodations. And that's when your ADA principles come in. The ADA means the Americans with Disabilities Act. You have to abide by that. The ADA requires to accommodate people with disabilities. Again, based on the exceptions, you may be able to get around that. But going through that interactive process is important, is very, very important. As religious schools, you may be able to say, hey, I'm exempted from the ADA, so you're out. You can't get the vaccine, you're out. You may be able to do that. I'm not going to speak to every specific situation, but let's say it's an employee that you like, that you want to keep, they're a good teacher. Can you accommodate them? You should. If you have 15 or more employees, the Americans with Disabilities Act applies, and you need to engage in an interactive process. I can send you the slides. There are interactive process slides in here that you can get more information on. You want to call me anytime. This is the stuff that I geek out on. So
if you share the slides with us, we can post them on the CISNA website as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. But so the disability accommodation and then the religious accommodation. So to give a vaccine and somebody says, hey, listen, I have a disability, you need to go through a direct threat assessment. So essentially what we're saying is, I'm the employer, my teacher A says, I'd say to the employees, hey, listen, everybody needs to get vaccinated now. You need to do it or you can't come to work on Monday. Okay, great. Employee A comes to me and says, hey, listen, I can't, I have diabetes. My doctor told me that I can't do this. You need to then go through whether you can even vaccinate him in the first place. If you can vaccinate him in the first place, and that's the direct threat assessment. You need to go through those factors as an employer and note it down. Always write your stuff down. Somebody said, hey, I need an accommodation. You wrote it down. Hey, this person needs an accommodation. We feel that them not getting vaccinated will create a threat, will create a risk in our workplace. But can we accommodate them? An accommodation may mean, hey, they work remote. I don't know if that's the case for your school. That's going to be a lot of what people say. Maybe they wear a face mask. Maybe they are a teacher that now has a plexiglass dome around them all the time. Now, not just because you have a duty to accommodate them, but not all accommodations have to be given. There is an undue hardship analysis. I'm really condensing like 45 minutes worth into 5 minutes, and I apologize. There's an undue hardship. So let's say employee A says, hey, I have diabetes, I can't do it. Okay, not getting vaccinated employee, that would create a direct threat. But can I accommodate you? Can I give you extra face coverings? Can I make you wear, can I put a shield around you? And if those are accommodations that you can make for that employee and they can still teach in school, great. They don't get the vaccination, they come to school and they still work. But if that creates an undue hardship, and in the slides, there is an undue hardship analysis for disability. If it creates an undue hardship, like you're going to have to spend $25,000 just to accommodate this employee, you can say, hey, listen, it's undue hardship. You can't come to work. I'm sorry. We're going to have to let you go. And then you can let them go. But that process, I basically just condensed down like a 2 to 3 week process with the employee down into like 30 seconds. Okay.
Right.
Now the religious accommodation.
Can we just take a pause for a second? Because I know that people set their schedules and I want to respect people's time. And if we do have an evaluation for today's sessions, Brother Fuad shared it with everyone and you can share it again. Please complete that evaluation before you leave today. Make sure you click on it so you have access to it. The other is Sister Sufia also put up that please join CISNA. We do a lot of advocacy and provide resources on legal issues. And I'm sure that we're going to be able to turn to Brother Muhammad a lot more often now and ask him for stuff that we can put on our website for you. So please take care of those two things, the survey and joining CISNA. And I will let you finish up.
Sure. I won't be offended if you leave. I promise. You can go. I promise. Last thing. So the religious. So we went through the disability. I know I went through it fast and I apologize. If you want to talk to me more, feel free to call me. The religious accommodation. I've seen a lot of Muslim groups saying, hey, listen, the vaccine is haram. I'm not going to, again, you refer to your religious authority. There are different sects in here. There are different religious rulings. You refer to that. If your employee B says, hey, listen, I'm not doing this. Islam says no. Courts generally say you're really not allowed to question them. But assuming that you're an Islamic school and assuming that the teacher is a Muslim, if you have an objective basis for questioning their religious belief, then you can. So assuming that it's a Muslim teacher and you have an objective ruling from somewhere else saying that the vaccine is halal, then you can question them and you can say, hey, listen, this is an undue hardship. You not being vaccinated is going to create a risk. Your religious ruling basis is questionable to me. We got to let you go. But again, that's an interactive process. I never counsel clients to say, hey, listen, fire right away. Have some meetings. Go through it. See if you can convince the employee. See if see if you can provide them information that would help them. See if you can accommodate them. Again, as an Islamic school, as a private school, you guys have a lot more leeway to to dismiss employees, and you can use that right. But I always say to my clients, the law is a ceiling, not a floor. So you can always go above and beyond the law, even though you have the legal right to fire somebody. Doesn't mean you have to. You can always try to have meetings with them, see if they can be convinced, and if it becomes a problem, and they need to be vaccinated, and your governing board feels strongly about that, you as administrator feel strongly about that, then let them go. That's totally fine. You can do that. You have those rights, but you have to consult an attorney, because there are going to be state laws that apply. There are going to be local laws that apply. We're only talking here about the federal level. Again, there are going to be state-specific laws that apply, and I know for a fact that they're coming. This vaccine issue is going to be a big one. Alhamdulillah, so far, a lot of teachers have lined up. Most people have lined up, but there will be a contingent. The last point that I'll make is vaccination should not be conducted by the employer. Most of you guys are private religious schools. I'm sure that you guys aren't doing that anyway, but that can be treated as an ADA violation because you're getting private medical information from them. Then that can be treated as a violation. So what I would recommend, if you guys are requiring vaccination, make sure that they go to their own doctor or go to an outside medical facility and then just provide you proof that they got vaccinated. Don't try to get involved in the process. There are a lot of other laws that apply. The ADA applies, it becomes an issue. So try as best as you can. Consult an attorney, I would say. Try as best as you can just to outsource that function and just have them provide you proof. You can have them provide proof that doesn't have medical information that's saying they got the vaccine, and then you can just kind of go from there. Somebody just asked, Sister Tamina asked, how can ADA be applied to a person who is not disabled but is avoiding the vaccine due to personal choice? That's a really good question. A lot of people are going to say, hey, listen, I just don't want to get the vaccine. I don't trust it. That's not enough. It has to be, generally speaking. Now, there may be laws in your state that say different. The EEOC even may come out with a guidance that says, hey, you gotta abide, or you gotta accommodate personal choice. As of right now, from what we know, an employee C says, hey, listen, I just don't want to get the vaccine. I just don't want to get it because it's not because it's a disability, not because of religion. I just don't think that it's for me. It's a personal choice. That is not enough. That's never going to be enough. So you can basically say, hey, listen, if you can't convince them, you're out. You can require it. And if it's not something related to medicine, like a disability that they have, it's not related to their religious belief, just personal choice is generally not enough. Again, facts and circumstances may vary. Always consult a lawyer, or always consult somebody, talk it through with somebody that you know that has some ADA knowledge. I'm happy to help, but just make sure of that for sure. All right. I went over 7 minutes. That's not bad, I think. I only took 10 minutes to explain vaccination. Again, I'm really sorry. You guys probably had more questions. I apologize. I wanted to go through it a little bit. I wanted to get to this and spend a little bit more time on it. But again, inshallah, please do. My email is up there. That's my office line. My cell phone, I'll put it in here, is 630-362-8115. Feel free to give me a call. I love hearing questions. This is actually the stuff that gets me excited. You guys might be crying about that, but it does. So inshallah, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear thoughts on the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this invitation. I really appreciate it.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair, Brother Muhammad. That was amazing, the amount of information that you were able to share, and all very interesting. Again, Jazakallah khair to our presenter. We thank you for joining us. Thank you, Brother Fuad, for moderating, and Sister Sufia, our Executive Director, for helping us out. If you have questions, please feel free to email Brother Muhammad or contact Sisna. He will share his slides with us, and we will post them for you, inshallah, on our website. And please join us tomorrow for more sessions. You have 3 tracks to choose from, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Jazakallah khair, Brother Muhammad, and thank you, everyone. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.